The strange thing about fear, Daniel Carter would later remember, is how loud it makes a quiet room. The station cantina smelled of recycled air, hot engine coolant, and the burnt edge of overbrewed coffee, the kind that clung to the back of your throat after a long shift. Hundreds of travelers filled the circular hall, voices blending into a low constant murmur beneath the hum of docking clamps and distant thrusters outside the glass walls. Cargo pilots laughed over cheap drinks, merchants argued over shipping lanes, and a trio of tall reptilian traders spoke in slow, musical clicks that echoed against the steel beams above. Yet in the far corner of the room, there was a pocket of silence that seemed to swallow sound itself. Daniel noticed it the moment he stepped inside. People didn't sit there, not even when the rest of the place was packed shoulder to shoulder. Tables nearby stayed half empty, chairs slightly angled away as if the space itself had become uncomfortable. And at the center of that quiet space hovered a woman in a small grav chair that flickered faintly with a tired blue glow. Her skin was a pale shade of blue, almost like frost under soft light, and long silver hair drifted around her shoulders as if the station gravity had forgotten to fully claim it. The chair supported her gently a few inches above the floor, its stabilizers giving off a soft mechanical whisper every few seconds. Daniel noticed the way people looked at her, and then quickly looked away. Some travelers would approach the empty seats nearby, slow down, recognize who sat there, and quietly change direction. Others kept their distance entirely. A pair of tall aliens at the next table stopped talking the moment her chair drifted slightly closer. One of them stood up without a word and moved 2 tables away. No one said anything. They didn't need to. Fear had its own language. Daniel paused near the drink counter with his tray, watching the pattern repeat itself. A waitress rolled past with a hovering cart of steaming bowls and glasses. Even she avoided that side of the room. The blue-skinned woman sat perfectly still, her golden eyes focused on the transparent wall of the station where ships glided past, like silent whales in the dark vacuum beyond. Daniel couldn't see anger in her expression, or pride, just something quieter, something patient, like someone who had grown used to waiting for a kindness that never arrived. The cargo engineer shifted his weight, the muscles in his shoulders still stiff from 12 hours inside a maintenance crawl space that barely gave him 3 feet of clearance. His uniform smelled faintly of machine oil and recycled coolant, and the small plastic tray in his hands held a sandwich, a bowl of station chili, and a dented metal mug filled with black coffee. He followed the empty seats again with his eyes. Too many of them. Too deliberate to be coincidence. The woman must have noticed him staring, because her golden eyes moved slowly from the stars outside to him across the room. Just for a second. Then she looked away again, as if already expecting what would happen next. Another human glancing. Another stranger deciding to sit somewhere safer. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. People are weird, he muttered under his breath. Then he walked straight across the room and sat down beside her. For a moment nothing happened, and that was the strangest part, because in a station filled with noise the silence around their table felt almost physical, as if the air itself had thickened. Daniel placed his tray down carefully, the metal legs of the chair scraping softly against the floor, and he noticed at least 6 pairs of eyes watching from across the cantina, while someone near the counter quietly muttered something in a language he did not understand. He ignored all of it and wrapped both hands around the warm mug of coffee, letting the heat soak into his fingers after hours inside a freezing maintenance shaft. Beside him the soft stabilizers of the grav chair hummed with a faint electrical whisper, and he could feel the woman's attention without looking directly at her yet. Eventually he glanced sideways and saw those golden eyes studying him with open confusion, not anger, not suspicion, but the careful curiosity of someone witnessing an unexpected event. The light above their table reflected faintly off her pale blue skin, and he noticed small silver connectors along the frame of the chair where advanced support systems linked into the armrests. The technology was elegant but clearly worn, the edges polished from long use. She spoke first, her voice calm and low with a musical tone that the station translator rendered into clear English inside Daniel's earpiece. "Human," she said slowly, as if testing the word. "Do you realize where you are sitting?" Daniel shrugged and tore open the wrapper of his sandwich as if this were the most ordinary conversation in the galaxy. "At a table," he answered, Unless I missed something important. Across the room someone coughed awkwardly, and another traveler stood up and moved farther away, dragging a chair with a long metallic scrape that echoed through the cantina. The woman followed the sound briefly and then looked back at him, the faintest crease forming between her eyes. Most individuals do not choose this location, she said. Daniel took a bite of the sandwich, chewed thoughtfully, and glanced around the half-empty space surrounding them. Yeah, I noticed that, he replied. He leaned back slightly and added in the same relaxed tone, people seem to be allergic to empty chairs today. For a moment her expression did not change, and then something unexpected happened. The smallest hint of amusement touched the corner of her mouth. It disappeared almost immediately, but Daniel saw it. You are not concerned, she asked, about the warnings you have clearly heard since entering this room. Daniel wiped his hands on a napkin and followed her gaze toward the crowd, where several travelers were pretending very badly not to watch them. Lady, he said quietly, I spend my days crawling through cargo reactors and plasma vents that run hotter than 600 degrees Fahrenheit. If a chair next to you was supposed to scare me, somebody forgot to explain why. The faint hum of the grav chair grew softer as the stabilizers adjusted, and for the first time her posture shifted slightly toward him rather than away. Her golden eyes studied his face more carefully now, as if searching for a hidden motive that refused to appear. Then allow me to ask a more precise question, she said. Daniel raised his mug and took another sip of coffee. Go ahead. The woman tilted her head a fraction and asked in a voice almost gentle with disbelief, Human Daniel Carter, do you not fear death when you choose to sit beside me? Daniel Carter did not answer immediately, and that alone seemed to confuse the woman beside him, because most conversations in the galaxy apparently came with quicker decisions than that. He simply took another slow sip of coffee while the question settled between them like dust drifting through a beam of light. Outside the massive glass wall of the station, a freighter the size of a city block glided past at a patient crawl, while its docking thrusters whispered softly against the vacuum. Daniel finally lowered the mug and shrugged one shoulder in a small practical motion. Fear usually requires a reason, he said. The woman watched him carefully, and the golden glow of her eyes reflected the station. Lights like small stars. You believe there is no reason in this case. Daniel leaned back in his chair and gestured lightly toward the room around them, where travelers were still pretending not to stare. If there was a good reason, somebody would have explained it by now, instead of just moving their chairs. Across the cantina, a merchant dropped a utensil, and the sharp clatter echoed longer than it should have. Daniel noticed the way the nearby tables kept their distance, as if an invisible circle had been drawn around the grav chair. He had seen behavior like that before in rough mining ports on the edge of human territory, where rumors traveled faster than facts. The alien woman followed his gaze toward the uneasy crowd, and her voice softened slightly when she spoke again. They believe my presence brings catastrophe. Daniel blinked once and looked back at her. That seems a little dramatic for a lunch table. It is statistically supported, she replied calmly. Daniel let out a quiet breath. That almost sounded like a laugh. Well, that sounds inconvenient. For the first time she tilted her head with a trace of curiosity. You respond to danger with humor. Daniel rested his elbows lightly on the table and studied the sandwich wrapper as if it were the most important engineering diagram in the galaxy. I respond to a lot of things with humor, he admitted. It helps when life drops strange situations on your plate without instructions. The faint hum of her grav chair adjusted again as internal stabilizers compensated for a slight shift in gravity from a newly docking vessel outside. Daniel noticed small data lights flickering along the side panel and realized the chair was far more advanced than the standard mobility rigs he had seen in medical bays. Whoever built it had cared deeply about the person using it. You are aware that several individuals have already contacted station security regarding your proximity to me, she said quietly. Daniel glanced toward the far entrance where two uniformed attendants stood pretending to examine a wall display while clearly watching their table. Yeah, I noticed that too, he said. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked back at her with an easy calm that had annoyed more than one supervisor during his career. But I still do not see the problem. The woman was silent for several seconds, and during that pause the entire cantina seemed to lean closer without moving. Then she asked the question again with a tone that carried less disbelief and more genuine curiosity. Human Daniel Carter, If the stories are correct and my presence truly brings disaster wherever I travel, why would you choose to remain seated beside me? Daniel tapped the side of his mug thoughtfully and answered in the most ordinary voice imaginable. Because every story I have heard so far started with somebody being too afraid to sit down and ask you if it was actually true. The alien woman did not answer right away, and for the first time since Daniel had entered the cantina, the silence around their table felt different. Not heavy with fear, but careful, almost thoughtful. The soft blue glow of the grav chair reflected faintly across the polished metal surface of the table, while the distant rumble of docking thrusters vibrated gently through the floor beneath their feet. Outside the wide observation glass, a cluster of cargo shuttles drifted toward their assigned berths like slow-moving lanterns in the dark. Daniel watched one of them for a moment while he finished the last bite of his sandwich and then folded the empty wrapper into a neat square. Beside him, the woman's golden eyes studied him in a way that suggested she was trying to measure something deeper than his words. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter now and almost reflective. In most regions of the galaxy, curiosity does not outweigh self-preservation. Daniel wiped his hands on a napkin and leaned back in his chair. Maybe that is the difference, he replied. Humans get curious first and worry about the consequences later. Across the room, someone let out a nervous laugh that sounded forced and quickly faded when no one joined it. Daniel could still feel the attention of half the cantina pressing toward their table, even though nobody wanted to admit they were watching. The woman followed his glance toward the crowd, and a faint shadow passed across her expression. For many cycles, travelers have been warned not to approach me, she said slowly. The results of those warnings have been effective. Daniel nodded toward the wide, empty space around them. Yeah, I noticed the impressive social distancing. That drew another brief flicker of amusement from her, so quick that most people would have missed it entirely. You make light of it, she said. Daniel shrugged. I have worked on freight ships for 12 years, he answered. I have learned that most disasters start because somebody stopped asking questions. He lifted the mug again and swirled the remaining coffee thoughtfully before continuing. So I figured sitting down and asking one was probably the safer move. The grav chair adjusted again with a gentle mechanical whisper, and this time the woman allowed herself to turn more fully toward him. The station lights caught subtle patterns beneath the surface of her pale blue skin, delicate lines that reminded Daniel of frost spreading across glass on a winter morning. You believe a conversation can change a reputation that has followed me across entire star systems? She asked. Daniel set the mug down and met her gaze directly for the first time. Maybe not the reputation, he said, but it might change the story I tell about you later. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, those golden eyes steady and searching as if she had spent years surrounded by noise, but very little honesty. Then she asked quietly, Human Daniel Carter, would you like to know why those stories exist in the first place? Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, while the distant hum of the station wrapped around them like a low mechanical tide. Yeah, he said with an easy calm. That was kind of the plan when I sat down. The woman remained quiet for several seconds after Daniel spoke, and during that pause the low mechanical rhythm of the station seemed louder than before. The distant hum of life support systems, the faint vibration of docking clamps engaging somewhere far down the ring, the quiet hiss of grav stabilizers adjusting beneath her chair. She turned her gaze toward the massive observation window again, where a long silver transport slowly rotated into its assigned berth nearly a quarter-mile away, its hull lights blinking patiently against the endless dark beyond the station. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a calm weight that felt older than the crowded room around them. The stories began 12 years ago near the outer navigation routes, she said. Daniel rested his forearms on the table and listened without interrupting, something he had learned during years of working around people who spent too much time alone in deep space. Ships began reporting unusual navigation failures when traveling within several million miles of my location. She continued. Guidance systems would miscalculate trajectories, communication relays would distort, and long-range scanners would produce impossible readings. Daniel tilted his head slightly as he processed that. Sounds like a software issue, he said. Many believed so at first, she replied. Engineers recalibrated equipment across multiple fleets, yet the disturbances continued. Her golden eyes moved slowly back toward him. Eventually, a pattern emerged. Daniel raised one eyebrow. "Let me guess," he said. "The pattern followed you." "Yes," she answered simply. Around the cantina, a few nearby travelers leaned subtly closer, even though they pretended to remain focused on their own conversations. Daniel could practically hear curiosity creeping across the room like a slow tide. "And that turned you into the galaxy's favorite superstition," he said. The word superstition drew another faint flicker of something almost like humor from her expression. "Many believed my presence interfered with advanced systems in ways they could not explain," she said. "Others concluded that I carried some form of technological contamination or unknown biological anomaly." Daniel nodded slowly. "People hate mysteries," he said, "especially the kind that mess with expensive equipment." The grav chair hummed softly as its internal balance adjusted again, and the subtle movement made the silver strands of her hair drift slightly in the station gravity. "The first transport captain who refused to fly, within 10 million miles of me, described the experience as traveling beside a storm that only machines could feel," she continued. That description spread faster than any technical report. Daniel leaned back slightly and folded his arms. "Yeah, that definitely sounds like the kind of story that would get exaggerated after a few drinks." Several cycles passed, and the rumors evolved into warnings, she said. "Entire routes were altered to avoid my travel path. Passenger liners refused to board me. Research stations denied docking clearance." Daniel glanced around the half-empty space surrounding their table again. "Looks like the tradition is still going strong." She studied him carefully. "Yet you chose to sit here despite hearing those same rumors within minutes of entering this room." Daniel shrugged again in that easy human way that seemed to puzzle her. "Look," he said, "if every engineer in the galaxy gave up every time a machine started acting strange, we would still be lighting rooms with candles." The station lights reflected in her golden eyes as she considered that. "You believe the disturbances have a logical explanation?" Daniel nodded. "Everything usually does," he said. "Sometimes it just takes somebody stubborn enough to sit down next to the problem and start asking questions." Daniel Carter let the words hang in the air for a moment after he spoke, and the reaction was immediate even though nobody at the nearby tables pretended to be listening. Somewhere behind them a glass stopped halfway to someone's mouth and remained there while its owner watched quietly. The blue-skinned woman noticed it too, but did not turn her head, as if she had learned long ago that other people's reactions were rarely the interesting part of a conversation. Instead, she looked directly at Daniel with an expression that carried something new now. Not disbelief, not caution, but something closer to curiosity. "You assume the disturbances originate from a mechanical cause," she said calmly. Daniel nodded once. "Machines misbehave all the time," he replied. "Usually because somebody built them with assumptions that turn out to be wrong." The soft hum of her grav chair shifted slightly as its stabilizers compensated for a mild change in station gravity caused by another docking maneuver. Somewhere along the outer ring nearly 2 miles away, the movement lifted her a fraction of an inch and then settled again with a quiet electronic whisper. Daniel noticed that the engineering inside the chair was far more advanced than anything a normal traveler could afford. The housing panels were seamless, and the data ports along the armrests pulsed with faint indicators that suggested experimental hardware. Whoever had designed the system had solved problems that most commercial manufacturers still struggled with. He leaned forward slightly, studying the faint glow of the chair's control interface. "That is an impressive piece of engineering," he said. The woman followed his gaze briefly before answering. "It was constructed for me by a research division that believed my condition might eventually be understood." Daniel raised one eyebrow. "Might be understood." She inclined her head slowly. "Because they discovered something unusual during their investigations." Daniel rested his chin against his knuckles in that thoughtful way engineers often developed when a puzzle appeared. "Now that sounds interesting," he said. Her golden eyes remained steady on him while the distant noise of the cantina faded into the background of mechanical hums and quiet station announcements. "The disturbances are not random system errors," she explained. "They occur only within a certain distance of me, and they affect nearly every form of advanced navigation technology." Daniel considered that for a moment. "So you are telling me your presence confuses machines across multiple star systems?" "That is the simplified explanation," she replied. Daniel leaned back again and exhaled slowly through his nose. Well, that is definitely one way to become unpopular with starship pilots. For the first time, she allowed a small smile to appear fully across her face, the expression softening the calm strength in her features. It has been described in less polite terms, she said. Daniel glanced once more around the nearly empty circle of tables surrounding them. People usually blame the thing they do not understand, he said quietly, especially if it interrupts their schedules. Then he looked back at her and asked the question that had been forming in his mind since she began explaining. So what did the research division actually find? The faint smile faded, but the curiosity remained in her eyes. They discovered that the disturbances were not caused by my technology or my biology alone, she said slowly. Daniel felt a spark of interest run through his thoughts the same way it always did when a mystery began to unfold. Then what was causing them? She held his gaze for several seconds before answering in a voice that was almost reflective. According to their data, the interference comes from something far stranger than either of those explanations. Daniel leaned forward again slightly, and the faint hum of the grav chair filled the quiet space between them as she finished the sentence. It comes from the way my mind interacts with the energy fields that power every advanced machine in this station. Daniel Carter did not respond right away because engineers had a habit of pausing when a statement sounded impossible but not entirely wrong. He leaned back slowly in the metal chair and glanced past the woman toward the long wall of observation glass, where the station's traffic lanes shimmered with the glow of maneuvering thrusters nearly half a mile away. For several seconds, he simply watched a cargo shuttle rotate carefully into alignment while his mind sorted through the pieces of what she had just said. Machines across multiple star systems malfunctioned around her presence, and according to the research division, the source was not a faulty device or hidden infection, but the way her mind interacted with energy fields. Daniel finally exhaled through his nose in a quiet, thoughtful breath. That is either the strangest engineering report I have ever heard or the most interesting one, he said. The woman observed him carefully. You do not appear frightened by the explanation. Daniel shrugged lightly. If I ran away every time somebody described a problem that sounded impossible, I would still be fixing vending machines on Earth instead of maintaining cargo reactors 200 light years from home. The faint hum of the grav chair deepened slightly as its processors adjusted again, and Daniel noticed the control panel flicker with tiny pulses of data. His curiosity sharpened instantly. Energy fields that power machines are usually stable unless something disrupts the resonance frequency, he said slowly. The woman tilted her head a fraction as if she had expected that line of reasoning. That is similar to what the researchers proposed, she replied. Daniel rubbed his chin thoughtfully. So your brain somehow produces interference in those fields. A form of resonance overlap, she answered. Daniel nodded slowly. That would definitely confuse navigation systems, especially the ones that rely on quantum field alignment. The woman's golden eyes brightened slightly. With interest, you understand the concept quickly. Daniel gave a small smile. I spend most of my life inside machines that people insist should not work the way they do. Understanding strange behavior is part of the job. Across the cantina, several nearby travelers were now openly watching the conversation despite their earlier attempts to appear uninterested. The rumors surrounding the blue-skinned woman had been circulating for years, yet few had ever seen someone sit calmly beside her and discuss the mystery like it was a routine engineering problem. Daniel noticed their attention but ignored it. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and studied the quiet glow of the grav chair again. If your mind is interacting with energy fields, that means your brain is producing a measurable signal, he said. The woman inclined her head. Yes. Daniel tapped the table lightly with one finger, which means it can probably be mapped, measured, and maybe even stabilized. The woman looked at him with a level of surprise she could not completely hide. No researcher has spoken about the phenomenon with that degree of optimism, she admitted. Daniel leaned back again and folded his arms comfortably. Engineers are stubborn like that, he said. We assume every problem has a solution until the universe personally proves otherwise. The woman watched him for another moment and then asked quietly, Human Daniel Carter, if the disturbance truly originates from my mind as the research division believes, what would you do next if you were asked to investigate it? Daniel glanced at the grav chair, then at the observation window. then back at her golden eyes. First, I would stop treating you like a walking disaster and start treating you like the most interesting energy experiment in the galaxy, he said. Then he added with a small, thoughtful grin, and after that I would probably ask you a very simple question. Daniel Carter watched her carefully after speaking those words, and the faint grin remained on his face not because he was trying to be clever, but because engineers often smiled when a mystery finally became interesting enough to chase. Around them, the cantina continued its uneasy rhythm of half-whispered conversations and cautious glances, yet the empty space surrounding their table remained untouched, as if an invisible boundary still warned others to keep their distance. The blue-skinned woman studied him for several seconds before asking quietly, what question would that be? Daniel lifted his coffee mug again and swirled the last inch of dark liquid inside it before answering. I would ask when the disturbances started and what changed in your life right before they began. The woman's golden eyes flickered slightly with recognition of the logic behind the question, and she leaned back a fraction within the grav chair while the stabilizers hummed softly beneath her. The phenomenon appeared after an accident 12 years ago, she said. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Accident. She nodded once and turned her gaze toward the observation glass again, where a long line of station lights stretched across the distant docking ring nearly 3/4 of a mile away. I was part of a deep space exploration program studying gravitational anomalies along the outer frontier routes, she continued. Daniel rested both elbows on the table again, listening closely. During one survey mission, our research vessel encountered an energy distortion unlike anything previously recorded. The researchers believed it to be a naturally occurring field interaction between two stellar currents. Daniel frowned thoughtfully. That sounds like the kind of thing scientists say right before something very complicated happens. For a moment, she looked almost amused again. Your interpretation is not entirely inaccurate, she said. The hum of the grav chair deepened briefly as she shifted her position, and Daniel noticed a thin interface band across the back of her neck where delicate silver threads disappeared beneath the collar of her uniform. During the survey, a containment failure exposed part of the research crew to the anomaly. She continued calmly. Most of the team experienced no lasting effects, yet my neurological scans began showing unusual resonance patterns shortly afterward. Daniel leaned forward slightly with clear interest. Your brain started interacting with energy fields after the exposure. Yes, she said. The change also damaged several neural pathways, which is why the grav chair became necessary for mobility. Daniel's gaze returned briefly to the elegant machinery supporting her, and he nodded with quiet understanding. That explains the hardware upgrade. She followed his glance. The chair compensates for the neurological disruption while allowing my research to continue remotely. Daniel tapped the table lightly with his fingers, thinking through the sequence of events. So, a deep space anomaly rewired part of your brain, and now every advanced machine within range thinks reality has changed its operating instructions. That description is surprisingly close to the scientific reports, she replied. Daniel leaned back again with a thoughtful exhale. Then the real mystery is not why machines malfunction around you, he said slowly. It is why nobody tried studying the effect instead of running away from it. The woman looked at him carefully again, as if measuring the sincerity of his curiosity. Many attempted research during the early years, yet the disturbances disrupted their equipment. Before meaningful results could be gathered, Daniel nodded once more. Yeah, that would slow things down. Then he rested his hands on the table and met her gaze again with the same calm interest he had shown since the moment he sat down. But I still think everyone started with the wrong question, he added. The woman tilted her head slightly. And what question should they have asked? Daniel smiled faintly and said, the one I am about to ask you right now. Daniel Carter rested his forearms on the table and studied the woman quietly for a moment before speaking. The hum of the station wrapping around them like distant surf, while the giant observation window reflected the slow movement of ships nearly half a mile away. Then he asked the question that had been forming in his mind since she first described the phenomenon. Have you ever tried turning it off? The blue-skinned woman blinked once in clear surprise, and the small stabilizers of the graph chair emitted a faint adjustment tone as her posture shifted slightly. Turning it off, she repeated. Daniel nodded calmly. If your mind is creating the interference, then somewhere inside that process there has to be a trigger, he explained. Something that activates the resonance. The woman watched him carefully, and for the first time since the conversation began, her expression carried genuine uncertainty. The research division attempted to dampen the signal through neurological suppressors and field stabilizers, she said slowly. However, none of those methods succeeded. Daniel tilted his head. That is not exactly what I asked, he replied. The woman paused again while the faint light of the cantina reflected across the smooth panels of her grav chair. You believe the phenomenon may be influenced by my conscious control, she said. Daniel shrugged slightly. I believe most things connected to the human brain are influenced by what the brain is doing at the moment. Stress, concentration, fear, curiosity, they all change electrical patterns. If your brain is interacting with energy fields, then your thoughts might affect the signal. Around them, several travelers had now completely abandoned the attempt to hide their attention. The rumor of the mysterious woman had filled this station for years, and yet no one had ever heard the problem discussed with such casual practicality. The woman followed Daniel's reasoning with quiet focus. The researchers did observe fluctuations in the resonance amplitude when my emotional state changed, she admitted. Daniel gave a small nod, as if a puzzle piece had clicked into place. There we go, he said. That sounds promising. The woman's golden eyes narrowed slightly with interest. Promising. Daniel leaned forward again, with the same calm curiosity that had carried him into dangerous machinery more than once during his career. If emotions affect the signal, then the interference is not just a random side effect, he explained. It is a feedback loop between your brain and the energy field around you. The woman absorbed that quietly, while the grav chair hummed beneath her. Daniel continued, speaking with the relaxed tone of someone walking through an engineering problem step by step. Which means the machines are not actually malfunctioning because you are near them, he said. They are reacting to something your mind is broadcasting into the field. The woman studied him carefully. That conclusion is similar to the final hypothesis recorded by the research division. Daniel smiled faintly. Except they treated it like a disaster instead of an opportunity. The woman's gaze moved briefly across the empty circle of tables surrounding them before returning to him. Why would you call it an opportunity? Daniel gestured lightly toward the enormous station outside the window, where thousands of systems hummed with invisible power. Because if your brain can influence energy fields across that distance, he said, slowly, then you are not a walking system failure. You might be the first person in the galaxy who can communicate with machines without touching them. For several seconds the woman said nothing after hearing Daniel's conclusion, and the quiet pause between them seemed to stretch across the cantina like a ripple moving through still water. Even the distant clatter of dishes and the low mechanical hum of the station felt softer, as if the room itself were listening. The blue glow beneath her grav chair flickered gently, while its stabilizers compensated for a slow shift in the station's rotational gravity nearly 1 mile away along the outer ring. Her golden eyes remained fixed on Daniel Carter, studying him with the careful attention of someone hearing a completely new interpretation of a problem that had defined her life for more than a decade. Finally, she spoke in a calm, thoughtful voice. For 12 years the galaxy has treated my condition as a contamination that disrupts machines and threatens navigation safety. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his arms with the relaxed patience of a man who had spent many nights inside engine rooms waiting for systems to respond. Yeah, I can see how that reputation would travel fast, he replied. Pilots hate anything that interferes with their instruments. The woman gave a faint nod. Entire trade routes were adjusted to avoid my travel path, and several research stations refused docking clearance after the first few incidents. Daniel glanced around the wide circle of empty tables that surrounded them like a silent reminder of those decisions. Looks like the tradition stuck around, he said quietly. The woman allowed the smallest trace of a smile to appear before continuing. Yet you suggest the disturbance may represent a new form of interaction rather than a malfunction. Daniel lifted one hand and gestured toward the massive station outside the observation glass where thousands of unseen energy systems powered life support, navigation beacons, and gravity regulators. Every machine in this place runs on fields that humans barely understand, he said. If your mind can influence those fields, then the machines are not failing because you exist near them. They are responding to a signal they were never designed to recognize. The woman absorbed his words carefully while the grav chair beneath her hummed with a quiet pulse. Your theory implies that the interference could potentially be controlled rather than avoided. Daniel gave a small nod. That is exactly what I am thinking. He reached for the empty mug and turned it slowly between his hands while his eyes moved toward the station lights glowing far beyond the window nearly half a mile away. Engineers look at strange behavior and ask how to stabilize it. Scientists look at the same behavior and ask what it means. But everybody else usually just runs away from the problem. The woman watched him with growing curiosity. And you believe stabilization might allow communication with machines? Daniel shrugged lightly. If your brain can broadcast a signal strong enough to confuse navigation computers across several million miles, then it might also be strong enough to guide them. The faint smile returned to her face, though this time it carried something warmer than before. For many years, individuals avoided sitting near me because they feared my presence would disrupt their equipment. Daniel leaned forward slightly and met her gaze again. Maybe they were looking at the situation from the wrong direction. The woman tilted her head in interest. Explain. Daniel tapped the table once with his finger and said quietly, if machines are reacting to your mind, then the real question is not how to stop the signal, but what might happen if you learned how to aim it. The idea seemed to settle over the table like a quiet gravitational shift, and for the first time since Daniel Carter had sat down, the woman did not immediately analyze his words with scientific distance. Instead, she looked toward the enormous observation window where the station lights stretched nearly half a mile along the outer docking ring and reflected softly across the glass, like a constellation that had been arranged by engineers rather than stars. For 12 years, every report about my condition described it as an uncontrollable anomaly. She said slowly. Navigation systems destabilized, communication signals distorted, automated docking programs misaligned. Daniel nodded once, as if reviewing a familiar maintenance log. Sounds like the machines were reacting, but nobody bothered asking what they were reacting to, he replied. The grav chair beneath her adjusted again with a faint mechanical whisper, while several of the small data lights along its frame pulsed softly. If what you propose is correct, then the signal is not chaotic, she continued. It simply lacks direction. Daniel leaned forward slightly and rested his hands on the edge of the table. Exactly. The woman studied him carefully. You speak about it as though the solution were obvious. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful shrug. Not obvious, he said, just logical. If your brain already interacts with the field, then learning to guide that interaction might be possible. Across the cantina, the quiet crowd had grown larger as travelers slowly drifted closer under the pretense of ordering drinks or checking messages, yet none of them dared enter the empty circle around the table. Daniel noticed them only briefly before returning his attention to the woman. Imagine if the signal could be stabilized instead of suppressed, he continued. Navigation computers would not experience interference. They would experience instructions. Her golden eyes widened slightly as the implication unfolded. A neural interface with machine networks. Daniel nodded. A living guidance system. For a moment, the hum of the station seemed to deepen, as if the machinery itself were listening to the conversation. The woman turned her gaze back toward the observation glass where a long silver transport nearly a quarter-mile away was slowly rotating toward a docking arm guided entirely by automated navigation. For years I believed the anomaly had ended my research career, she said quietly. Daniel followed her gaze toward the distant ship. Maybe it just changed the direction of your research, he replied. She looked back at him, and there was something different in her expression now. Not the calm patience of someone used to isolation, but the cautious spark of possibility. You speak about this with remarkable certainty for someone who heard the problem only a few minutes ago, she observed. Daniel smiled faintly. Engineers do that, he said. We see a broken system and immediately start imagining how it could work better. The grav chair emitted another soft hum while its sensors reacted to subtle shifts in the station's energy grid. If the signal can be guided, then the effect could extend far beyond navigation computers, she said thoughtfully. Daniel nodded slowly. That is the part everyone else probably missed. He gestured lightly toward the endless network of lights, machines, and power conduits spread across the massive station around them. Every machine in this place runs on energy fields, he said quietly. If your mind can influence those fields, then learning to control the signal might mean something far bigger than fixing navigation errors. The woman held his gaze as the realization fully formed. You are suggesting the anomaly may not be a malfunction at all. Daniel Carter leaned back in his chair and answered in the calm tone of someone who had spent his entire career repairing impossible machines. I am suggesting it might be the first step toward a completely new way for intelligence to communicate with technology. For a long moment the woman did not speak, and the quiet hum of the station seemed to stretch between them like a low mechanical tide. The lights of the docking ring nearly half a mile away reflected across the observation glass, while the enormous cargo transport Daniel had been watching slowly locked into its berth with precise automated movements. Around them the crowd had grown thicker, yet the invisible circle around their table remained untouched, as if the old fear still held the room in place. The woman's golden eyes moved from the distant ships back to Daniel Carter, and this time the calm expression she wore carried something far deeper than curiosity. It carried the first hint of hope she had allowed herself in many years. For 12 years, every report about my condition concluded that avoidance was the only practical response, she said quietly. Travel restrictions, research containment, and long-term isolation. Daniel nodded once, as if acknowledging a technical summary, rather than a tragedy. Yeah, that sounds like the usual solution when a problem scares people more than it interests them. The faint stabilizers beneath her grav chair hummed softly as the system balanced against a slight shift in the station's gravity regulators somewhere deep in the structure. The small lights along the chair's interface pulsed in slow rhythm, as if responding to the conversation itself. You are suggesting that the phenomenon might be redirected rather than suppressed, she continued. Daniel leaned back slightly and folded his arms in the relaxed posture of someone thinking through a new design. If your mind can already interact with those fields, then suppression is probably the hardest possible approach, he said. Guiding the signal would make more sense. The woman studied him carefully. Guiding a resonance field produced by neural activity would require extremely precise emotional and cognitive control. Daniel smiled faintly. Humans train pilots to land ships, traveling several thousand miles per hour using instruments they barely understand, he replied. I am pretty sure a determined scientist could learn to focus her thoughts. Her expression softened at the word scientist, as if that identity had nearly faded from her life until this moment. For many cycles I believe the accident had ended my work entirely, she said. Daniel gestured lightly toward the vast station around them, where countless unseen systems moved energy through miles of circuitry and field conduits. Looks to me like it might have changed your specialty instead, he answered. A quiet pause followed, and the woman's gaze drifted once more to the distant stars beyond the station, where the faint blue curve of a nearby gas giant filled half the sky. When the research division first detected the resonance in my neural patterns, they described it as an unpredictable disturbance that should be contained, she said slowly. Daniel tilted his head. Engineers usually call that the early prototype phase, he replied. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly at that. Around them, several nearby travelers had begun whispering openly now because the conversation had clearly moved far beyond the rumor that once defined her presence. The woman returned her attention to Daniel and asked in a voice that carried equal parts curiosity and cautious determination. If your theory is correct and the signal can be guided, then what would be the first step toward proving it? Daniel Carter looked toward the observation window, where the newly docked cargo ship rested against the station like a silent metal mountain nearly a quarter-mile away, and then he looked back at her with the calm confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime solving mechanical puzzles. The first step, he said quietly, would be seeing if you can make one small machine listen to you on purpose. The suggestion lingered in the air between them while the station continued its quiet mechanical rhythm, and for a moment the woman simply watched the enormous docking ring outside the observation window, where thousands of tiny lights traced the shape of the structure nearly half a mile away. The cargo transport Daniel had noticed earlier sat motionless against its berth like a sleeping metal city, while automated service drones drifted slowly along its hull performing routine inspections. Around them, the cantina had grown almost completely silent because the nearby travelers could sense that something unusual was happening at the center table they had avoided all evening. The blue glow of the grav chair beneath her flickered softly as its stabilizers compensated for a subtle shift in the station's gravity grid somewhere deep within the structure. The woman turned her golden eyes back toward Daniel Carter and spoke in a voice that carried a calm strength he had not heard before. If the signal truly responds to my thoughts, then focusing it intentionally should create a measurable change in the surrounding field. Daniel nodded once with quiet approval. Exactly. You do not need to control every machine in the station, just one small system close enough to respond. He glanced briefly toward the drink dispenser mounted on the wall behind the counter roughly 20 feet away, where a small automated indicator panel blinked steadily. Something simple like that unit would be. Perfect, he said. It is connected to the station grid, but the processing load is small. The woman followed his gaze toward the dispenser, and the faintest trace of uncertainty crossed her expression. For 12 years I have attempted to suppress the resonance entirely, she admitted. Directing it would require doing the opposite of everything the researchers trained me to do. Daniel leaned forward slightly and rested his hands on the table. Then maybe it is time to try something different, he replied. The grav chair hummed softly while the small lights along its frame began to pulse, more quickly as if reacting to subtle shifts in her neural patterns. She closed her eyes for a moment, and the room seemed to hold its breath with her. The distant hum of the station deepened as energy flowed through miles of conduits and field generators surrounding them. Daniel did not speak again because he knew engineers learned best by watching systems respond. Several seconds passed, and then the small indicator panel on the drink dispenser flickered once. A few of the nearby travelers gasped quietly while trying not to draw attention to themselves. The woman's eyes opened slowly, and the golden light within them reflected the blinking panel across the room. Daniel followed her gaze and smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just watched the first successful test of a new machine. Looks like it heard you, he said softly. The woman stared at the dispenser for several seconds as the indicator light blinked again, slightly brighter this time, responding to something no one else in the room could see. For the first time in many years, the expression on her face was not shaped by caution or isolation, but by the unmistakable realization that the strange signal she had spent 12 years trying to silence might actually be the beginning of something extraordinary. Daniel Carter leaned back in his chair and glanced around the cantina, where dozens of stunned travelers now watched the small blinking light across the room. Then he looked back at her and spoke in the calm tone that had started the entire conversation. Turns out the galaxy was wrong about you. The machines were never afraid of you at all. They were just waiting for you to speak.